So Tearfund is it's an international relief and development agency. It's a Christian organisation, and we mainly work through the local church, which is the world's biggest network. There are churches in places where government doesn't really reach, and no other organisations really reach as well, except maybe Coca-Cola. They get pretty much everywhere too. So my particular job there has been leading the UK campaigns team, helping the church speak up about causes of poverty to our government here in the UK. And these days I'm doing the same kind of thing, but internationally. So I'm still working for Tearfund, and I'm coordinating a campaign called Renew Our World, which is Tearfund and many other Tearfund-like groups in many different countries campaigning together. And climate change is top of our list because of the impact it's having on people on poverty. So you probably know this already, but I think many people in Britain don't. When they hear climate change or climate emergency, they start thinking about nature first, maybe. And I think things are changing. Instead of thinking that in Britain, a bit of climate change, a little bit of warming sounds rather nice, they're starting to think about the impact on us. And the damage to people elsewhere in the world is more likely to be what we see that's spectacular on our TV screens. They're more likely to think maybe of California or bushfires in Australia than they are about the world's poorest people. And it's good to be thinking about other people in richer countries like Texas, like California, maybe like China, like the floods we've seen in Germany, like our friends in Australia. It's certainly good to be thinking about those things and those people. But it's the world's poorest people who are mostly being hit hardest by climate change, and mostly did the least to cause it, and mostly have the least resources to fall back on and deal with the damage that they're being hit by right now. So Tearfund has been aware of this for a long time. So we first started back in 1992. We ran a campaign called Whose Earth? And that was our first look at creation care, climate change, and the impacts on people in poverty, the people we serve. And that was a long time ago. And the church has changed its view a great deal since then. So I think the biggest thing that we need to know is this is just changing people's lives in everyday, mundane, ordinary life. It's not just about big disasters, it's about the day-to-day. And I remember hearing from a colleague who'd been talking to a woman from a village in Malawi. So this lady was around 60. She was a grandmother, and she said that when she was a girl, they'd been able to, each of the different households in her village had been able nearly every year to harvest a good crop of maize that would last them the year and leave them a surplus over to sell. And they'd harvest the maize, and then each house would have a granary to keep it in, which is like a hut behind where their home. So a separate little outbuilding, and it was carefully built to keep rats out. It was carefully built to stay cool and preserve the crop. But she says that these days, her granddaughters don't know what a maize granary is because nobody needs one anymore, because they no longer harvest anything like as much maize as they did when she was a girl, because the climate has changed. The rains are not reliable. Most years, when she was little, they used to get reliable rain. They would know when the rainy season was, they'd know when to plant. There would be a harvest. Not quite every year, but nearly. But these days, it's not like that. The rainy season it doesn't last as long, and it starts and stops. So you don't know whether to plant when the rains start because you're gambling. You know they might stop again and start later or not start at all. So her village now is much hungrier than it was when she was young. And that's a global pattern. So for decades, up to the year 2016, the number of people facing hunger each year was falling. That was a great pattern. In fact, I think it was the period in human history where the most people have been rescued, have found ways out of hunger that we've ever seen. But in 2016, that pattern that had been slowing for a while changed. And that was the first year the numbers of people in hunger started to increase again. And they still are. And that's because of the changing climate. and also because of conflicts. But the climate part is bigger. So it's about everyday life getting harder for people who already had the fewest resources. Now, there are things we can do about that. So, for example, one of the things Tearfund works on with many others is about conservation farming, helping people find ways to cope with diversifying, so there's more than one crop, more than one source of income, more than one sort of livestock, to hedge their bets as the climate changes. And many of these things would have been good anyway, even if the climate wasn't changing. So things like beekeeping, changing, starting micro enterprises so you've got something to sell that isn't dependent on farming, changing the crops so that you switch to a different crop that is more drought resistant, growing beans or peas that enrich the soil. There are so many things like that, and there are lots of different there's lots of different training courses that Tearfund's involved with, and my favourite of those is called Farming God's Way, which runs in Malawi and Zimbabwe. So there are lots of things, practical things we can do to limit the damage that climate change is doing, but climate change, as we know, is going to increase. The prospects aren't good. And then, of course, there are disasters. There are more disasters. And in fact, you may have seen in the news recently, in Madagascar, in the dry part in the south of Madagascar, there is a famine. So there are food shortages that are turning into famine. People are running out of food, having to start eating roots and leaves of plants that aren't food, because that's all there is left. And this is the first climate famine that scientists are identifying with confidence. So we used to have to say that any particular weather event didn't prove anything because the weather changes. So we can say climate change means we expect more droughts and more floods and more heat waves and worse storms. But each time there is one, we couldn't say for sure that was the impact of the changing climate. We just said this was the kind of thing we expected climate change to do. But nowadays, in the last 2 or 3 years, the science has moved on, and scientists are now much more confident about attributing a particular disaster to the changing climate. And the drought, the long drought in Madagascar, is the first one, or it's the first one that I've seen where scientists are saying, yes, this is a climate famine. But it won't be the last. Even if we do a brilliant job and we do reach net zero by 2050, and we do all the things we're setting out to do, the climate will still get a bit warmer. There's no chance of it. We can still limit it to 1.5 degrees of warming, but it will certainly warm from the 1.1 degrees of warming we've had so far up to 1.5, and that will have an impact. Another disaster you might have seen that is going to happen more often is more flooding. So as water warms, as you know, the sea level rises. And so for people living by the coast, the risk of flood increases. And as the air warms, it can hold more water. And so the amount of rainfall that can land in a short time increases. And the power of a hurricane or a cyclone gets stronger. The amount of water it can release on a vulnerable coastline is bigger. And at the same time, we're finding the speed it moves on is slower. So when a hurricane makes landfall, the damage it does before it moves on is likely to be greater. And I remember a couple of years ago hearing from one of my colleagues who works in Mozambique saying that his house was washed away. His mother-in-law's house was washed away. He wasn't able to do the thing I was asking him about because he was just having to stop to down tools and go and look for his mother-in-law and see if she'd survived or not, which she did. But again, I'm going to hear that much more often from colleagues, and it's starting to happen more often already. So that's the situation we're in. It's an issue of justice, and it's an urgent issue of immediate damage, and it means that we have the huge motivation to act now, because we know the more we do now, the less damage will be done in the future. Have you heard of Catherine Hayhoe? So I'd like to share a film with you. Tearfund made a little series of 9 short films with Catherine Hayhoe. They have a discussion guide to go with them. And Catherine Hayhoe is perhaps the perfect person to communicate climate change to evangelical conservatives in the US and elsewhere, because she's a climate scientist, she's a Canadian, she's lived in Texas for the last 20 years, and her husband is a church pastor. And she's a superb communicator. So we love her. I wanted to show you this film.
How is climate change affecting the developing world where organisations like Tearfund work?
The reason why we care about a changing climate is not because a 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 degree increase in the average temperature of the entire planet really matters that much to any one of us. It's because that temperature increase, like the first domino in a row of dominoes, kicks off a series of interconnected impacts and events that affect all of us around the world, but affect the poorest and most vulnerable more than any. The single best description I've heard of climate change was coined by the US military, if you can believe it, and it's this: climate change is a threat multiplier. In other words, it takes all of the other issues that we already care about, all of the issues, for example, that are exemplified by the Sustainable Development Goals, issues of poverty, hunger, lack of education, basic healthcare resources. It takes these issues and it makes them worse. Another way to think about it is with this image of a bucket with a hole in it. We're pouring all of our efforts into this bucket to alleviate poverty, hunger, disease, lack of access to clean water, refugee crises, and more. Yet that bucket has a hole, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger over time, and there is no way to fill the bucket if we do not patch the hole. The hole is climate change. I care about climate change specifically because it does affect the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. It's no accident that there is a direct correlation between people who are already living in poverty and people who are most vulnerable. Because how climate change affects us is by loading the weather dice against us. In the places where we live, we know that we've always had heavy rainfall, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, droughts, storms, wildfire, and more. These are a normal and natural part of life on this planet. But the warmer it gets, the more frequent or the stronger and more damaging these events are getting. We know that the frequency of heavy precipitation is increasing. We know that heat waves are getting more extreme. We know that droughts are getting stronger. We know that wildfires are burning greater area. We know that cyclones, hurricanes, or typhoons, all the same storm, they're just called different names in different parts of the world. We know that they're not getting more frequent, but they're getting much bigger, stronger, slower, more powerful, with a lot more rainfall associated with them. And then there's the long-term changes, like creeping sea level, with 2/3 of the world's biggest cities, many of those in developing countries, lying within just a meter of sea level. So why does climate change matter? It matters precisely because it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable in the world. If we have a flood in a rich country, it can be devastating. It can produce very expensive damages. But if they have a flood in a developing country, as occurred, for example, 2.5 years ago in Bangladesh during the monsoon season, where due to the abnormally heavy rains, 1/3 of the entire country was underwater, the impacts can be beyond belief. Where I live in Texas, we experienced a massive record-breaking drought in 2011 and 2012. Where we live is, climatologically speaking, very similar to Syria. And in Syria, they also experienced a drought that's estimated to be 2 to 3 times more likely as a result of a changing climate. But that drought was occurring on top of an unstable political system, on top of poverty, on top of ongoing conflict, a pre-existing internal refugee crisis, all of which led climate change and its impact on the drought to be like the final straw on the camel's back. You can have a healthy camel that doesn't have much on it. It can absorb that extra straw. But if you have a camel that is malnourished, underfed, in poor health, already overloaded, that's when climate change can truly be the final straw that breaks the camel's back. Another example, and this is the exact same event this time, was Hurricane Matthew. Hurricane Matthew hit the Carolinas in the United States in October 2016. It produced billions of dollars worth of damage, and it led to the loss of 28 lives. Now, those are very serious impacts, but before it hit the coast of the United States, it hit Haiti, which is the poorest country in all of Central and North America. In Haiti, the headlines look like this: we've lost everything. In Haiti, they already had cholera, and the epic flooding that resulted from the hurricane exacerbated the cholera epidemic. In some places, up to 90% of people lost their homes. All across the world, since the 1960s, it's estimated that the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries has already increased by 25% due to the impacts of a changing climate. And this past year, the United Nations warned that climate change threatens to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. We care about climate change because it is a threat multiplier. Climate change is not only an environmental issue. Climate change is a poverty issue. It's a hunger issue. It's an issue of inequality and injustice. Climate change is a human issue, and that's why we care.
Thanks, and please could you show the resource slide as well? So I wanted to show you a list of resources that Tearfund's providing to help us engage well with COP. So they're all from the same, they're all available on the same web link, tearfund.org/reboot. There's this film series with Catherine Hayhoe, which has a study guide to go with it. So it's 9 short films. That one's the longest. There's a template email you can send to your MP. There's a template talk that you or somebody else can give in your church. There's a youth resource called Take a Stand, so young people can raise their voices. There's a COP church service that we're planning for churches to show in the middle of COP on Sunday the 7th of November, but you can do it anytime. And you can pick and mix the ingredients from that as you like them. There's an international prayer toolkit, which you can get from renewourworld.net, which is the bit I'm working on. And there are prayer resources during COP itself. There'll be daily videos and texts. And on Saturday the 6th of November, there'll be a big march in Glasgow, and it's happening in cities and towns around the world, and there will also be some near you. Grand, thank you. Could you take the slide away again for a moment? And before I finish, I just wanted to say COP is really important. This one is particularly important. There are many things that we discussed there. The 2 biggest things are emissions. Will we together will each government set out a plan that takes us to limiting warming to 1.5 degrees? So over the last couple of years, many governments have published new plans. They're better than they were before. If all the governments keep all of their promises, that would be a miracle. But if they did, it would take us to 2.4 degrees of warming, which could be a lot worse, but would still be disastrous for millions of people. We need them to do better than that. The other thing is money. Money is always important. There was a promise many years ago that rich countries would transfer $100 billion a year of climate finance to poorer countries every year from 2020 to 2025. And so far, they haven't done it. It was $83 billion last year, which is a lot, but not nearly enough. Not enough to keep the promise, and not enough for countries to negotiate and trust each other well at COP. So we need the rest of that money. So emissions and money are the 2 most important things they're going to talk about at this COP. And then I wanted to leave you with 2 campaigning successes. So raising our voices doesn't always work, but many times it does work. So in this country, we won the Climate Change Act in 2008. It was groundbreaking. Many countries around the world have copied it since. It means our government have a climate target. They have 5-year climate budgets, carbon budgets, to say how much emissions need to be cut by in a 5-year period. And there's an independent body that advises them what the target should be and writes them an annual report to say how well they're doing and what they need to do next, and doesn't hesitate to be critical. So that's been brilliant. And the other one is a campaign success in Malawi a couple of years ago. So Malawi banned plastic bags, which has had a big effect on its climate emissions, on its environment in many ways, and its carbon emissions from people no longer having to burn the plastic to get rid of it in a country with not much rubbish collection. So the church had a voice in both of those, and we won. We spoke out and we prayed, and that's what we need to do for COP2. So I'll stop there and we'll go into the next round of discussion. Thank you.
A question for that. Do people in our churches and communities know that climate change is making poverty worse around the world? And when people know, does it motivate them to do more about climate change? Okay.